Geology, geology, geology. Welcome everybody to another show of mini geology. Constantly evolving international affairs are the predisposing factors for the expansion strategies of companies, but also governments and organizations. They also affect supply chains. They affect the geographic regions, the businesses, the entire industries. So let's emerge in the forces that give shape to those places where we work and study our beloved discipline of geology. Today with us, the analyst Jacob Shapiro. Jacob Shapiro, founder of Perch Perspectives, connected from Louisiana. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I will read your website in Perch Perspectives, and I understand that Perch advises businesses and policymakers on historical, cultural, geographic, political, and economic forces, all of those that impact these international affairs. So which are the, for example, historical forces that impact the international affairs around energy? And I ask you about energy because energy is something that is very close to geology. Geology and energy, they are interconnected. And I would like to ask you these several elements that you study, starting from the history.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a whole podcast just on the history. But no, energy is bound up. The history of energy is really bound up in everything that is happening in the world right now. I think the two most important issues happening in the world today are A, climate change, but then B, the fourth industrial revolution, the switch from the digital economy into the smart economy. And we wouldn't have gotten to the fourth industrial revolution if we didn't first have the steam revolution and then moved on from there to electricity and everything that happened as a course of that. And in order to get from steam to electricity and electricity to digital, that's where hydrocarbons came to the fore. In some sense, World Wars I and II were really the first conflicts about hydrocarbons and the sources of energy that undergirded these industrial revolutions. I think this is actually one part of those conflicts that is not generally well appreciated. When we're thinking about World War II, we're thinking about the Holocaust and fascism and ideology and Hitler. But when you actually look at what Nazi Germany was doing, well, they had to push to Romania because they needed the oil fields. That was sort of priority number one. The reason Japan gets involved in the conflict in the first place is because the U.S. puts an oil embargo on Japan, and that is the red line past which Japan feels that its national interests are getting violated. So really, in some ways, the entire geopolitical story, I think, of the 20th century is in some sense about energy and specifically about hydrocarbons and how they powered our economy. And it's with that historical context that I think we have to think about the shifts that are happening today, because we are moving for the first time in over 100 years, probably away from sole dependence on hydrocarbons, certainly in the developed world, less so in the developing world. That's just a dream for some of those countries like in India or a South Africa. They can say that and put it on paper to make the Westerners feel good about themselves, but they're not switching anytime soon. But that shift, all the technology that's going to go into it, I think that's the historical context that we have to think about when we're thinking about energy in 2021 and beyond.
You mentioned that historical, cultural, and human experiences, these are three forces that they impact the international affairs. And you put them in contrast, if you want, the other three forces: geography, power dynamics, and economics. So that is why I would like to go through these 6 elements to let us understand what is the essence of these forces, how they work, or an example of how they work, and why we have like 2 clusters of them in your mind, in your view.
Yeah, that's also a great question, and we could spend a lot of time on it. I would say that, well, just first of all, from my company and my general perspective on analysis, at a certain point, I think there isn't a difference between, say, economics and culture, or politics and history. I think these are actually divisions that we make that aren't necessarily accurate. What is economics if not the sum total of what a bunch of individual decisions are going to be made? Economics, it can be theories. We have textbooks, we have all these other things. But fundamentally, what economics is what you're going to buy, what I'm going to buy, what our children are going to buy, whether we're going to have children. All those decisions that go into how you're going to spend your money, that is the science of economics, just trying to abstract it. So in that sense, I try and focus on the human elements as much as those broader extrapolated trends. So if we're taking cultural and talking about energy, obviously that's a huge topic. It's going to be dependent on the particular market. But just to sort of draw out a couple of ties, in countries that are sources of oil and natural gas, those things have real cultural cachet and cultural value because they are the things that have allowed certain countries or certain families or certain companies to be successful. Saudi Arabia exists, for instance, as a country because of oil. It wouldn't be there if there wasn't a bunch of oil in the desert. There would be a bunch of tribes running around a desert with no other value if it weren't for the oil that were there. And you're even watching how Saudi Arabia is now trying to transform its entire culture, trying to go from a society that is based on having cheap oil and build some kind of modern state out of it. There's a whole host of cultural issues to deal with there. The United States is another very interesting one. The United States has gone through, I don't know how many transformations when it comes to energy. It used to be the biggest energy producer, then it wasn't the biggest energy producer, and got obsessed with Middle Eastern politics because it was worried about not having access to energy. Then you get fracking, and all of a sudden the U.S. is a dominant energy producer again, and you've got these fracking companies that are out there, and the boomer bust cycle in cities like Houston, New Orleans. I'm in Louisiana; it's a big part of the economy here. You can sort of feel how things are going in the economy locally here based on where the price of oil is at, how happy people are going to be, how much they're spending at the restaurants. All that other stuff is refracted through, is oil high? Are the oil companies making money? How are energy companies doing? So it really depends on the market. It really depends on the makeup of what's there. But I think it's fair to say that at a cultural level, each nation, how it gets access to energy defines large parts of individual existence and even national imperatives.
Jacob, what are your biases when you do this analysis?
Um, I try not to have any as the first answer to that question. I don't believe that that's possible. I believe that we all have our biases. I guess if you want to ask, I think we'd have to get more specific about a question for me to understand my exact biases. But if I'm putting my cards on the table when it comes to energy, I've already kind of alluded to it. I think climate change is one of the biggest challenges that humanity is facing, full stop. And if you think that that is one of the biggest challenges, it's obviously going to tinge how you see what's going on in the world, what different countries are doing, what different policies are out there. Um, I actually think my tendency is to overcorrect. So if I know I have a bias like that, it's actually more dangerous to me because I will overcorrect in the opposite direction because I am so obsessed with not letting the bias interfere that I'll go all the way to the other direction and maybe end up on that side. How we use energy and how that affects climate change is sort of really one of the few truly human problems I think we have, that it doesn't matter on your national borders. This is something we're all dealing with. And if I have a bias, it's that I'd like to leave the world a little bit better than I found it. And our energy industry, our consumption of energy, the way that we use our resources, it's not geared that way. So,
in your work, in your professional work, you try to preview the future, but the future is never written. So how do you explain this apparently contradiction in what you do?
sure, just because something is not possible doesn't mean that there isn't virtue in trying. I will say that I come from a tradition at Stratfor at Geopolitical Futures before, from an analytical tradition of thinking that you can predict things. And I obviously think you need to be thinking about the future and that there are things that you can predict. That what you can do is that you can lay out a spectrum of possibility. What scenarios are possible? And it doesn't matter how outlandish they are. If they're possible, we put them down on paper. We examine what the possibilities are, what things would have to happen for that scenario to play out, what thing would prove that that scenario is not playing out. And I have found that if you can really be disciplined about putting all the possible options down on paper, and then you've done the hard work of thinking about, okay, well, if this happens, I'm going to have to do X, Y, and Z. And if this other thing happens, well, then I have these considerations. That thought process, that exercise, It helps you to prepare for risks. But then also, it also helps you capitalize on opportunities. If you can see a market inefficiency, or if you can see where there's going to be a place where there's going to be a future need, maybe you can strategically make sure to position assets so that if that scenario comes forward, you are ready to capitalize on that and move forward. So it's not about having a perfect crystal ball. I'm suspicious of people who claim to. It's about doing that hard work of challenging yourself to think about the possible, and then being honest with yourself about what things you would have to see for that future to be coming to pass.
If you can, Jacob, without disclosing too much of your personal work, would you mind to give us an example of a geopolitical risk assessment related to energy?
Let's just take two examples. If we're talking about solar today, if somebody was a producer of solar energy, or if somebody was hoping to build solar capacity, I'd be telling them one of the things they need to be watching out most importantly right now is Peru, and sort of mining in general for the resources that are going to be important in the production of solar technology. Peru is particularly concerning right now because the front runner in polls for the presidential election is talking about nationalizing the mining industry. And Peru is a top producer of copper, zinc. I mean, you want to go down the list. Peru is a major producer of all these things that are critical to solar and to clean technologies. So if you were somebody who was producing solar panels, or if you were a government or you were a business that was investing in solar, I'd be telling you to look at, okay, well, what are the inputs for your product? Where are you getting them from? What is the reliability of your inputs, et cetera? That would be one geopolitical risk scenario. Another one, I mean, if we're doing sort of the traditional oil sort of geopolitical risk factor, that's much easier. And it's actually, when you're in my field, you tend to admire the big oil companies because they believe that geopolitics is so important that they have entire teams internally devoted to these things. They don't come to people like me because they have 30 of me in a department making sure to think about these risks. I've been trying to bring those same tactics and those same analytical methods to agribusiness and aerospace and tech supply chain, in part because the oil industry has focused on them so much. But oil, it's obvious why that's so critical for an oil company. You're taking something out of the ground in one place, and you have to go bring it to another place, and everything has to work seamlessly. And if there's any disruption there, then you're going to be in trouble. So, we could go on to pick any country that is particularly unstable right now. Let's call it Libya. Libya has been in a civil war for multiple years. Not only is it a civil war, you've got outside powers who are using Libya to compete with each other. The French are competing with the Turks, and then the Turkish Navy is locking onto French ships with their radar sites in the Mediterranean. Egypt is there, is messing around. They have their own militias that they're supportive of. So if you're thinking about, okay, well, if 1 million barrels of Libyan oil are going to come on the market, that's going to affect prices. And to understand whether that's going to happen, you need to understand what's happening on the ground in Libya. How are all these different militias and ethnic groups and tribes competing against each other? Then you need to sort of lay in that top geopolitical layer. What is France doing? What is Turkey doing? Why is Egypt messing around here? How do the three of these countries interact with each other? Why does Turkey suddenly want to be best friends with Egypt? What's all that about? All of that is going to give you insights as to when and how Libyan oil production is going to ramp up, decrease, et cetera. So if I was dealing with a client who was in Libya or who needed to make sure that their access to Libyan crude was safe, I would take apart all of those different pieces and try and give them a lay of the land and a sense of the things that would affect them most.
Can people or organizations affect their own circumstances, or only the nations, the states, they have this role, this
This is the
power?
great argument of sort of geopolitical analysis. I come down very much on the idea that we have agency over our own outcomes, and that being prepared and having good intelligence and knowledge is what allows you to affect change. There are plenty of analysts out there who are better known than me who will tell you that no, everything is deterministic and it all depends on where this mountain is or where this river is or all that other sorts of stuff. And I dismiss most of that, honestly, as just not serious work. Things can be harder or they can be easier depending on what your circumstances are. But you asked about my bias. If I have, maybe this is my bias. I really do think that we have free will, and that you can use knowledge to assert power over your geography, over your environment. I don't think geography is one of these things. Obviously, it's an important factor, but it's not the sole determining factor. Even geography changes over time. Maybe not to you or me. Maybe it takes 100 years, but none of this stuff is set in stone. Even the stone is not set in stone.
So I understand that you think that the human factor is more important than geography. But within the human factor, I was wondering if people or organizations or companies, they can affect their own circumstances, or if not, then only the very big players and powerful players like a state can do that.
It depends on the issue. That might be an unsatisfying answer, but there's no one rule there. Certain problems are even beyond a state. Certain problems are beyond even the United States being able to do anything, the most powerful country in the world right now. Other problems, a country like the United States is probably too big and hulking to actually affect. And this is actually one of the big challenges was when you're an analyst like me, because when I talk in these terms, I'm talking abstractly and I'm talking about big picture forces. But when I actually get in the room with a client, it's really about drilling down very, very specifically into, you have a mine here. You want to make sure that the resource that you're mining here gets to this port and then gets there. We have a very specific set of circumstances we need to talk about then, rather than all this grand highfalutin stuff. And this goes back to your point about the human versus the geography. It's both. I think you need the big picture, call that geography, call that economics, call that the abstract, whatever word you want to put in there. And then you also need the micro perspective. You need to know what the individual human on the individual level is doing. And it's in the intercourse between those two things that I think you actually get the actionable insight that you need, and you actually start being able to craft those scenarios that I was talking about and plan for true risks down the road. So the answer to your question is yes. Like it's both. Like you are constrained to your circumstances and to your geography, and you absolutely have control over that as well. Doesn't matter whether you're an individual, a state, or a company. That just means you have different powers and different levers that you can pull in order to get your outcomes.
Let's dive now into the energy. The energy industry today, I think, according to you too, is facing the most massive geopolitical transformation since the discovery of the world's largest source of petroleum in Saudi Arabia. This happens in the late 30s. Why is this the most massive geopolitical transformation?
Energy is behind everything that we're doing. The fact that you and I are talking right now doesn't happen if we don't have energy underlying it. You were talking about culture. I think tech companies get the lion's share of sort of credit these days, right? Tech companies and tech bros are the celebrities. We've got Elon Musk running around. When you actually think about how things work, how you get things from point A to point B, why your lights actually turn on, why you can plug your router in and suddenly you have connection to an internet, it's all about energy. And I think it's hard to argue that we're as a world, we're changing the way we think about where energy should come from and what the acceptable sources of those energy are. For a long time, it was just all about hydrocarbons and getting hydrocarbons as efficiently as possible from point A to point B, and everything was based on that. And across the developed world now, whether you're the United States, whether you're France, whether you're China, everybody and their mother has a plan about weaning themselves off of hydrocarbons and of having a more diverse base between nuclear, wind, solar, renewables. I mean, that's what the conversation is. And it's not just empty rhetoric. I mean, we're seeing tangible policies to change energy grids and to change all these inputs so that it isn't so dependent on hydrocarbons. So I just think that's a fundamental change in how the economy is working. The metaphor would be, you went from eating one kind of protein to using a completely different other kind of protein to power your body. It's the same sort of metaphor. We're changing the underlying structure of the way that our economy and the way that we connect works.
You are an analyst, so you are telling us conclusions based on data and not really perceptions. So I understand that if you say that the tech companies are the protagonists of the moment, it means that you know that. And I understand in between lines that this is not the same for oil and gas companies. Maybe on the opposite side, they are the anti-hero, or they are the antagonist. But if you say that everything is based on energy, including this conversation we are having, why the world created this antagonism with an industry that is giving you the energy to move forward, or maybe moving from one energy to the other one? Who created that and why?
Another great and cutting question, really. And here we're going to have to, you did me credit by saying that I'm an analyst and I rely on data. But to answer that question, I'm going to have to step out a little bit and talk a little bit more about perception, or at least my perception of it. And I think it's a combination of a couple things. First of all, it's human nature to want to have someone to blame for things. It's what we do. When there's a problem, when there's something happening that we don't like, we find someone to blame and we blame them, whether it's right or not. We all sort of need that punching bag to get the what's the right way to say it, to not think about our own roles in these things. We need to take somebody else and say it's their problem. They're the reason that this is happening. I would also say that there have been a number of high profile accidents when it comes to energy. I mean, I'm in Louisiana. People still talk about the Deepwater Horizon rig here, and the fights about who had to pay for that and who was responsible and why did it happen. No matter where you are in the world, there have been accidents that obviously predispose people to not to having some of those negative feelings. And then last but not least, I mean, climate is already changing. So when you experience a natural disaster, when you experience weather patterns that don't make any sense, when you hear all this stuff about, oh my God, like cities are going to be sinking within 20 years because the polar ice is melting, that scares people. And the energy companies become, like I said, that blame agent for those things. And even politically, I mean, when we talk about, politicians have to capitalize on the fears and loves of their constituents. So they're going to put up those scapegoats that they need to in order to stay in office, particularly in democracies. It's much easier for authoritarian governments, I think, to deal with some of this because they don't have to worry about that. But if you're in a democracy and you're trying to run for office, it's great to have somebody to blame for problems. It's great to have a big problem like climate change or anything else, and to say, and I've got the person that we need to regulate right here. If you elect me, I will make sure they are regulated. So it's probably some combination of all of those things. And I think what the honest analyst would say to all of this is that, look, yes, there is a problem, and it's a problem of all of our making. Like, we all benefited from this system. It's nobody's fault. It's not like anybody planned this 100 years ago. People didn't know any better. So if we're actually going to make a good faith effort to change in a way that is beneficial for everyone, maybe we shouldn't blame each other. Maybe we should sit down, have a rational conversation, and think about, well, okay, we're in the situation now together. How can we move forward together? But now we're in the land of fantasy. That doesn't happen in politics.
So, Jacob, I understand that one thing is the science of the study of the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geology, the past, the climate of the past, and in the understanding why the climate is changing. And another thing is, let's call it environmentalism, as an ism is never positive. So it seems that this environmentalism has been detached from the science of studying the climate. What will be the role of environmentalism in the near future? Is it going to be used, as you said, by the politicians to do something? What?
First of all, I'm not sure that every ism is bad. I mean, off the top of my head, idealism, pretty good. Optimism can be a great force for change in the world. Pragmatism is something that I exercise on a daily basis. So I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I take your point, though. I think your point is that ideology, especially when it transforms into orthodoxy, is really bad. It retards growth. It holds things back. It's usually a leading justification for violence and other nasty things that humans do. So from that point, I take your point. And in terms of environmentalism, any good cause can be used for good and for bad. the 2020s itself is really not going to be about responses to climate change. It's going to be about the politics around that. The best example is this ongoing feud between the European Union and the Mercosur free trade group in South America. Now, France is the one that has sort of put a stop to that free trade agreement from going forward. And France says that that's because they don't like what the Bolsonaro government is doing in the Amazon with the forest fires there. They think that the Bolsonaro government is not doing enough to protect the Amazon. Okay, fine. I might even agree that the Bolsonaro government's not doing enough. But that's not why France is against the Mercosur free trade agreement. France is against the Mercosur free trade agreement because a lot of French exports are agricultural exports, and they are scared that if they have a free trade agreement with Mercosur, a lot of these agricultural producing South American countries are going to crowd those French exporters out of the market. And they're going to do real damage to a very important component, not just of France's economy, but France's cultural cachet. We're talking about food now. That's the thing that the French are known for and pride themselves on, getting back to the culture question. So on the one hand, we have the use of environmentalism in a political way to put an end to this free trade deal. And then we have the underlying political substructure, which maybe doesn't have a whole lot to do with the environment. And maybe it's even a little bit disingenuous of Paris to say that this is really all about climate. So I think that's going to continue to happen. I think that's going to happen increasingly throughout the course of the decade. You're going to see a lot of virtue signaling. A lot of countries are going to want to seem like they are at the forefront. And they're going to want to claim some kind of mantle of power because they are at the forefront. You're going to see developed countries like the United States, maybe, for example, really taking China to task or telling India that it needs to change its energy mix sooner rather than later. Not, when from the Indian or Chinese perspective, they look at the Americans and say, well, you've just been doing this for the last 2 centuries. Now we have to do all this other complicated stuff. We can't enjoy the cheap, easy way to industrialization and technology that you guys have had. Please, like, don't use environmentalism and this cudgel to hold us back. You're obviously not working in good faith. So I think that tussle we're going to see throughout the course of the 2020s. I don't expect countries to really start cooperating or coordinating with each other with climate change on a real way until it's in our faces, until it's unavoidable. And it's just not there right now. I mean, there are signs of it. You can see that things are changing. You can even start to predict some of the negative effects, but they're not so negative right now and not so catastrophic that they're causing us to do anything. One of the comparisons that I've made continually is between COVID-19 and between climate change. Climate change overall is a much more challenging issue, probably poses a greater threat to all of us at the end of the day, but it's such a big issue and it involves so many things that we can't make these hard political decisions about what we need to do in order to manage it. It's like the frog that is slowly boiling in the water. Whereas COVID-19, suddenly there's a disease that is killing 2% or 3% of people, and lock everything down, and we're going to wear masks, and we're going to change the way that we eat, change the way that we work, change the way that we do all of these other things because this challenge is present and in our faces. Until that happens with climate change, I think it's going to be more about the politicization of these things, about using climate to get what we want. We would have used some other ism, as you said, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but today this is one of the isms, one of the boogeymen that tends to work on people.
So could it be that if this ism, let's call it environmentalism, could it be a political, since it is an ism, a political ideology to rival the populism and nationalism?
Sure, I think in some sense it already is.
And so if so, will the nationalists play against the consequences of global warming in the long term? Because you say right now it's a matter just of how to use politically the environmentalism. If the populism and nationalism they are on the other side, so that means that they would temporarily play against the problems that we have about the global warming.
Yeah, so 2 things there, and I think those are some good points, but I'd push back a little bit. The first is we're going to have to find another word besides environmentalism, I think, because there are environmentalists who are not what we're talking about right now. There are environmentalists who really are making a good faith effort, who believe that there are problems and who are trying to solve it and talk about the urgency of the issue in a way that I fundamentally respect. Not everybody who who believes that climate change is a problem is using the environment or using climate change as a political cudgel. So I don't want to paint with too broad a stroke there.
Yeah,
Maybe
I
I think
agree with you, Jacob. I agree with you. We're on the same wavelength. Is we need another word. Please allow me to rephrase that with this new other word. The question remains the same.
yeah, and the answer to your question is that and nationalism, populism, these other ideologies that we're talking about, they are infinitely malleable. They are flexible. They can contain just about anything. That's one of the things about isms. They're orthodoxies. You don't actually need reason. You just need to convince enough people to feel that particular way. So, going back to the example we just used with Mercosur and with the European Union and France in particular, well, there, nationalists are using a climate issue in order to create an economic and political end. In that particular case, the nationalists are quite happy to make common cause with our environmentalists or climate power politics folks, whatever you want to call those people. Um, for populists, if you had a major natural disaster today somewhere in the United States that was directly attributable to climate change, I could imagine a populist rising and trying to capitalize on whatever damage or destruction or tragedy came out of that conflict and try and propel themselves into office. Populists are really just about connecting to people, connecting to their fears, and giving them what they want in some fundamental way. There are folks that will cut the other way too. In places like Louisiana, populists will go the other direction. They'll almost support energy companies to a fault, no matter what they do, whether it's good or bad. They want to give them every advantage because they know that most of the people in those areas make their money from the energy companies. It doesn't make sense to go after them that way. So you need somebody else. You need to go after these guys who are threatening the energy companies and threatening your livelihood. So when you get into populists, nationalists, these strong environmentalists that we're talking, anybody who's using an ism in that way, the lines aren't rigid. They will use whatever is in front of them to get to their political aim. And usually their aim is to gain power. So they can usually do the opposite of the thing that they were complaining about that got them to power in the first place. So it's not neat. And I think for me, the key takeaway is anytime anybody is using language or issues in that way, anytime anyone is making it seem like it's a black or white issue, there's good or evil, it's this or this, that's never right. That's the sign of somebody who is trying to get you to buy into what they're doing for political purposes, not somebody who is thinking long term and strategically and pragmatically about, we have a common issue. How about we work together to figure out what compromises we have to make to solve it? Anybody who's actually doing the hard work of doing that stuff, it's never either or.
Jacob, we were talking about this geopolitical transformation, this massive geopolitical transformation that is being experienced in the energy sector. Another important element beyond the climate change is the United States shifting to be net oil exporter.
Mm-hmm.
And so, do you think that the United States, as an exporter, have to navigate new physical and digital infrastructures to move their products? So the global supply chains are being kind of dismantled as the COVID-19 accelerates this shift towards what you would call multipolarity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I would like to better understand if it is important or not, the factor that the United States decided consciously to become a net exporter of this product to create energy.
Yeah, I don't know how much it was a conscious decision and how much it was just the thing that made sense in the moment. The United States has a penchant for not thinking strategically or long term, just sort of doing whatever the easiest thing is in the moment. But I think the answer to your question is absolutely. And this is true of technology. This is true of pharmaceuticals. We're seeing that now. It's true of energy. In this multipolar environment, and for listeners who are not familiar with that term, that's just a really pretentious way that people like me make the point that the United States is not the dominant power in the world anymore. There's going to be a lot of powers vying for influence in their own regions, so there's going to be multiple poles of power. Hence we get the word multipolar. And the world really hasn't been like this since before World War I. The last true global multipolar environment, I would say, was before 1914, because basically before 1914 everything was multipolar. From 1914 to 1945, everybody's fighting over the future. From 45 to 91, it's a bipolar world with the U.S. and the Soviets, and then since then it's really been a unipolar world. We're moving back to that multipolar age. And when I look at history and I'm trying to find analogs, you start looking at what was happening in the world before 1914. And to your point, it's exactly this issue. You have empire states that were competing against each other, and they had their own colonies that had the resources that they needed. So you get your colony and I get my colony, and I get what I need from this colony and you get what you need from this colony. You have these competing systems that are separate from each other and sometimes competing against each other. So what does that have to do with the US shifting to oil exporter? I think in general, you're going to see the US use that position as an oil exporter, not necessarily to maximize profit, although some of that will be there, but also to buttress relationships with important countries. If it can supply energy, if it can make a country dependent on it for those energy supplies, that's just another lever, excuse me, of influence that the United States can use there. And there really is this huge shift where it's not just the shift to the US as an oil exporter, it's also the shift that means that because the US has so much oil, it's less dependent on the Middle East, which is happening at the same time that some of these Asian countries, especially China, especially India, but not just them, South Korea, Japan are also in this mix. They are now dependent on the Middle East. So you have this major shift where the US is going to use its energy resources probably to strengthen its relationships with countries that it identifies as strategically important, while countries like China, like Japan, like India are going to be going out and looking for that exact same resource. So India is probably going to export a lot of oil from the United States in the future because the US wants India to be an ally. China is going to get way more involved in Middle Eastern politics than it has ever been before in its long history because it's not going to take oil from the United States, doesn't want to be dependent on it. It will go to the Saudis and the Iranians and everybody else who suddenly they don't have the American market to soak it up in concern. So all that shifting landscape is happening. And to your point, as the technology spheres and as the supply chain spheres diverge from each other, yeah, if you want to go into one sphere, you're going to have to either say the right political magic words, or you're going to have to be on the right network, or you're going to have the right technology. I mean, everything is going to be used, I think, to separate those blocks from each other. That's the world I see us moving towards.
So that means that these regional power blocks and also evolving centers of gravity around the world, they will force companies to establish a kind of a more diverse supply chains that emphasize maybe the resilience and the adaptability. Maybe new bases of production that will be prone to protectionism and interstate conflict.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The way I sometimes think of it is, in the unipolar moment where the United States was doing everything and everything was flowers and peace and freedom and et cetera. Um, the maximum economy of scale was global. You wanted to sell everywhere, to everything, to everyone. The world was it was just a massive competition throughout the course of the world. There were a couple markets that were shut off, like nobody could get into North Korea. But for the most part, you could aspire to play globally. That's not true anymore. Globalization sort of hit a high watermark and it's receding right now. And I don't that's not sort of doom and gloom. I think within some of these regions that we're talking about, you're actually going to get even more integration. But it does mean I think you're going to have to prioritize what regions you're in. When you think 10, 15 years out, if things continue to develop on this trajectory, and things might change, but I think this is the most likely trajectory. But if things continue to develop like this, you're not going to be able to be in the Chinese ecosystem and the American ecosystem and the European ecosystem at the same time. There's going to be, or the Turkish ecosystem. There's going to be a lot of competition there. So there'll be zones that you're able to move in and out. There will be zones that are just blocked to you for protectionist purposes or national security purposes. It's going to be a very, very different environment. I just said I did a presentation last night for a supply chain group, and I sort of told them, like, for the last 30 years, the supply chain has been easy. Like you've had a holiday for the last 30 years. I'm sorry to tell you it's over. I mean, we're going back to that world where you can't just go to China and get everything you need for your supply chain. You can't just depend on selling to the Chinese to fix all your problems. You're going to have to start thinking about resilience and backup plans. And, oh, maybe I'm not going to get access to this market because my government and their government don't have a good relationship. All that is back. Geopolitics is back. And I think it's back for the next couple decades at least.
Jacob, can you summarize these regional power blocks for us?
Sure. You mean like the actual blocks themselves, which blocks
Yes.
I see emerging? Yeah, that is. So I think that is somewhat in flux. I wouldn't, this is not my final answer on that, but I can sort of sketch out what I think are the initial ones, and some are more clear than others. The obvious ones are the US bloc. And I would include in that block the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, I think also falls in that block.
What about
Um,
Italy?
well, that's up to Italy. I believe Italy signed up for the Belt and Road not that long ago. What was that? 2 years ago when I was there when y'all announced it. I'm sure Italy wants to be part of it, but no, Italy will be part of the European bloc. I would say the biggest shift in my thinking in the past 5 years is that I was very, very skeptical of the European Union as a political project, even 5, maybe even 3 years ago. I'm much more bullish now, and I'm much more bullish not because the internal forces that threaten the EU are any less present. It's because the external forces are so much bigger. So the EU looks around and it just had 4 years of Trump. That wasn't so great for the EU. Russia is still there. China is doing its thing. I see that I think a lot the EU bloc is being pushed closer together because the only way a lot of these EU countries like Italy can remain globally relevant is if they pool their resources together. And I think that's going to be enough to see a stronger, more unified, more sovereign European Union. And I think the pandemic really accelerated some of that. It'll still be difficult. Somebody's going to need to tell Hungary that they need to get on the same page as everyone else and some of these others. But I mean, even Salvini, the skeptic extraordinaire, like he's not taking Italy out of the EU. He wants to use all that to get more things for Italy from Brussels, but give me a break. He's not taking the EU out. So a European bloc, I think, is in there. A Chinese bloc. Obviously, China's basically big enough to be a bloc unto itself. Some wild cards that we really need to figure out what direction they're going in. India. I sort of changed my mind on India on a day-to-day basis. One day I think India is going to be the next China. The next day it seems like India could fall apart tomorrow. And I think that reflects some of the Indian condition. The Modi administration is really trying to build a more centralized modern state. If they're successful, that'll be a sphere. If not, it'll get tacked in probably to the American sphere. The EU just started free trade agreement negotiations with India again. Interesting part of that. And then the two other countries I'm thinking about the most are Turkey and Brazil, and both have plenty of problems and plenty of issues, but both also have every reason to try and build those regional economies of scale and have shown a willingness to think in terms of using power to furthering their means. So that's not the exhaustive list, and there are others that could pop up depending on how things go. If you'd been talking to me a year ago before Ethiopia had its terrible civil war and the things that have been going on there, they're a very interesting country. If they could ever put it together, they have what you need on paper to be that kind of regional economy of scale. Could say the same thing about a country like South Africa. They have everything on paper they need geopolitically to do this. But history and culture and all these things that we were talking about has prevented them so far and probably will going forward. But yeah, if I was going to summarize very briefly, it's the US, China, EU, Brazil, Turkey, India are the major ones I'm thinking about, and then looking at the edges. And then just to finish that thought, that obviously means that for me, it's the places in between these blocks that I think are going to be the most dynamic, the most risky and opportunistic regions in the world. And that's Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America. I think that really is the theater for geopolitical competition for the next decade, at least, probably for the next 2 decades. And it's why we spend so much time not just on those big powers that dominate the blocks, but what are they doing in those in between regions? Who is in Uzbekistan and trying to build infrastructure in Uzbekistan, and how are they competing with each other? How are China and Russia and the United States and the EU all competing to try and get in on the ground floor of Latin America and get access to resources and new markets and things like that? So that's kind of the picture of the world as I see it today.
You mentioned a couple of countries in Africa. What will be the role of the continent, Africa, whose growing population will need new resources in safer places?
Sure, I have a pithy answer for that. I've been saying recently, Africa doesn't exist. There's no such thing. Yes, there is a big continent there, but once we get past oh, there's a continent, the word Africa really doesn't mean anything. Africa is hugely diverse. It's made up of a lot of different types of states, a lot of different groups, a lot of different religions, you name it. The geographic regions are extremely different from each other. East African countries share basically nothing in common geopolitically with West African countries, South African, the North African Arab countries, all incredibly different. So it really depends on what region we're talking about here. Because, for instance, East Africa, and I don't want to hurt your listeners' brains too much, but East Africa is the westernmost limit of the Indo-Pacific. So when we're talking about the Indo-Pacific competition and we're talking about China versus the US versus India and the Straits of Malacca, all those other sorts of things, well, the place that's going to be borne out on the western side is East Africa. And that's why you have so much competition and so much unrest right now in countries like Mozambique. We're talking about energy. What's been happening in Mozambique, nobody's been paying attention to in the global media. We've been talking about it at Perch since we launched a year ago because it was one of the key pressure points we saw from the very beginning, and it's because it's at the center of that Indo-Pacific competition.
What can happen there? Why the tension is so high? What could happen in Mozambique?
Well, the reason the tension is there are a lot of reasons the tension is so high, but I would say it's a combination of three main forces, probably more. But number one, it's an issue in domestic Mozambique issues itself. So they fought a civil war, a couple decades ago that was quote unquote resolved, but not everybody disarmed, and none of the political questions have been solved. So you have these parts of Mozambique where the government is just not strong. It doesn't have the authority or the power to assert itself. Northern Mozambique, around Tanzania, that area, that really also is a religious borderland. So this is reason number two. That's where Christianity and Islam kind of all mixed together. It starts to go from majority Christian to majority Muslim, and we've seen throughout the world right now what's happening in the Islamic world in particular and how they're interacting with the modern world. So it was not a big surprise to me that the Islamic State has latched on to Mozambique as a lily pad once it kind of got booted out of the Middle East. And the sad fact is that people care about the Middle East more than they care about Mozambique. So the US was willing to go in and bomb people in the Middle East to protect from ISIS. But if it's in Mozambique, okay, they issue strongly worded statements, and that's probably about it. And then the last thing is what I just alluded to. I mean, Mozambique is rich in resources, particularly natural gas. And it is at the center of geopolitical competition. The French are obviously there and thinking in terms of translating their influence into energy resources, but China is there. The United States is wondering about it. India is also expressed interest. So when you get all those things pushed together, you just have a pressure point that you have to watch over time. And unfortunately, that's one where the pressure was too much for that political structure to handle. And now you've got a real degree of lawlessness on the ground as well. So.
Jacob, I think that the common sense is that there is no country strong enough to fight a conventional war with the United States anytime soon. So the developing technology may become the focus of national security for many countries. Which sectors of the technology will develop?
Well, let me just say, as it pertains to a conventional war, it depends where the war is and what the objective is. If China tried to invade the United States, we're thinking crazy now. Like China wouldn't be able to do that. If the United States tried to invade China, they wouldn't be able to do that either. It doesn't really matter on that level. But yeah, I think that's why you see so much emphasis on technology and especially on cyber. I think cyber is going to be one of the areas where you're going to see conflict because it has plausible deniability. It doesn't result in sort of kinetic conflicts and things like that. But it's a way for these countries to hit at each other. We've already seen that with the interference in elections that's been happening, against and disinformation operations all over the place. But yes, the reason that China and the United States have been obsessed so much with this next generation technology equation is because whoever controls technology is going to be able to control everything from politics to economics to military force. It's not just the US and China. Russia wants its own economic system, techno ecosystem. The EU wants the same. The UK is even dreaming that it can have its own. Everybody, the whole zeitgeist right now is about being self-sufficient and having your own system and not having to go on to somebody else's network. So for that reason, everybody's competing over the next great technology. And again, so many historical analogs for this. We already talked about World War I, World War II. Those were conflicts also about who had the best technology. The United States ends World War II with the nuclear bomb because it has the technology faster than anybody else. The Cold War was one big technological war, if you want. The whole reason we have microchips and we have cell phones in our pocket is because the United States needed a little tiny device that it could put on a missile so that it could fire it more accurately at the Soviet Union. All of this stuff is sort of interconnected. So it's nothing new there. I don't think it's anything innovative to say that technology is going to be front and center in this conflict. I would just say that anytime you're in that sort of conflict where powers recognize that they can't just defeat each other outright, then you move to the in-between ways, the ways that you can try and get an advantage rather than taking someone head on.
I go back to geology. I would like to know your perspective on this discipline that could apparently be far away from what you do. But geologists, they know both the surface and the subsurface of the Earth, as well as the closest planets and satellites. So where do you think, with this kind of knowledge in this community of geoscientists, where should the community focus to teach the geology, or where should work the geologists that they are losing their jobs right now in the energy sector because there is a contraction and we have so many layoffs? You have so much knowledge that could evaporate in few years.
Well, if maybe I'll be quintessentially Jewish here for a moment and answer a question with a question. Why exactly are geologists losing their jobs so much? From where I sit, it would seem to me that the skills that geologists have would be more in demand than ever. I understand that they would be maybe different skills. Maybe we're looking for different things on the Earth's surface than we were before, but it's not like we suddenly lost our need for geologists. It seems to me that the discipline is more critical than ever.
Why do you say so? What are you thinking about? Which kind of elements are needed?
Well, let's say for the sake of argument, everybody agreed that climate change was a major problem and everybody was going to move to renewables. Okay, then we're going to need rare earths and we're going to need copper and we're going to need all sorts of minerals in abundance that aren't easily at our fingertips. And the only way to get most of these things is to get them from the Earth's surface. If we continue on with the hydrocarbon economy, we need geologists. We need to find more hydrocarbons and develop them. And if we go the other direction, we're going to do clean and renewables. We still need the geologists. We need to find all those input sources that are going to be necessary to build these technologies that everybody is talking about. So it seems confusing to me that we wouldn't have demand for geologists unless it's being automated somehow. Maybe are they building drones that are just hovering around and doing all the work for you? That we'll probably have a drone who's going to do this podcast with you on geopolitics within 5 years. You won't even need me.
So, Jacob, what is the direction in your analysis that we will take? Going towards the renewable or remaining into the hydrocarbon paradigm?
Obviously, we're going to go towards renewables, and each country will go at a different pace depending on what kinds of technology, what kinds of capital, what kinds of resources they have internally. The EU is obviously probably moving most rapidly towards renewables, in part because they have the least amount of resources, I think, available to them and the most capital to spend. So you put those two things together, it's kind of obvious why they're moving forward. The United States will be a laggard. The United States doesn't have to move that quickly. A country like China has to move as quickly as possible because they don't want to be dependent on foreign sources of anything. And the longer they're dependent on importing hydrocarbons over a long supply chain, they're going to view that as a national security threat. So the sooner they can develop those indigenous sources of renewables, they're going to. So it's really a case by case basis. I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all for any country in the world from that point of view. But if we can extrapolate one thing generally, everybody's going to be moving towards renewables somewhat. Some will be a little, some will be a lot, but it's going to be a bigger portion of the mix for everyone, full stop.
Did you ever analyze the role that could play the so-called carbon tax or carbon cap?
Yeah, so I haven't done any specific work on that, or haven't had a client who has been specifically interested in that. I think it's an interesting. I mean, obviously, I've kept up with it, and I read about it a lot, and I think about it a lot. But that's just one of a number of policies that I think politicians are trying to think about and use in order to to shift in some of these ways that we've been talking about. In the same way that I was talking about before, there's no silver bullet. There's no policy that's going to fix everything here. I'm sure a carbon tax, in conjunction with a lot of other policies designed to get to a goal, could be very effective. I'm sure also if you just, a carbon tax, that's going to fix everything. If you just, rolled out that policy that way, probably would be disastrous. So it's really not about carbon tax itself when I think about that question. It's about what is the strategy and what is the goal here, and what is the carbon tax actually doing? Is this just something to make people feel better about themselves, as is often the case, I think? Or is this really part of a broader strategy that is going to bring everyone forward towards a future that is beneficial for everyone? I think there's probably a role for carbon taxes there, but it needs to be in that broader conversation.
Thank you, Jacob. We are in conversation with Jacob Shapiro, founder of Perch Perspectives, and connected from Louisiana today. And Jacob, I would like to leave an open mic for you to address the audience if you want to add anything else, if you want to pitch, if you want to say hello to anybody, if you want to add things that you couldn't have said because I didn't ask you. The mic is yours.
Well, that's great. First of all, congratulations to you for this podcast. I do a fair number of these things, and you had the hardest questions and the most interesting questions of any podcast I've been on recently. So I commend you for that. It was a pleasure to be with you all. I'll take the opportunity to plug my company and the work that we do. So it's perchperspectives.com. Much like you, we have a podcast that comes out every other week, and we talk about geopolitical issues and how they intersect with lots of other things. We have some free content and some sample reports on our website, but our bread and butter is we support companies that are trying to figure out how geopolitics is affecting their bottom lines. If you email info@perchperspectives.com, I'm following that account. So if you want to talk to me about what we can do for you, or you just want to yell at me about anything you heard on this podcast, that's a good email address to send your your missives and your complaints to.
All right. Thank you so much, Jacob. This was another episode of Mini Geology, where we put in connection geology with society at large. I hope that you enjoy this deep dive into those forces that they forge the international affairs, and especially the energy sector, because it's close to the geology, but we saw so many different elements that they are the ingredients to try to understand the geopolitics. Again, this is Daniel Minizini. Thank you so much, Jacob.
Cheers.